Support for the Capital Connection comes from New York State United Teachers, working to support students, educators, and public schools as the center of their communities through the Public Schools Unite Us initiative. It's the Capital Connection. Hi, I'm David Gustina. Joining us this week, back again for more, Yancey Roy, Albany Bureau Chief for Newsday. Welcome back, Yancey.
Great to be back, Dave.
Well, obviously, I brought you on today. You are the Albany Bureau Chief for Newsday, which covers Long Island. There was a solid Republican win out there for the elections this week. And you're also covering New York City, which was huge. All eyes were on it, including the national media, where Democratic Socialist Zohran Mamdani has prevailed. So let's start there. Obviously, that's the big story. Yancey, what are your takeaways after seeing what happened in this election?
Well, if you want to take a look at the big takeaways from this, I think we should back up a little bit to way back when this started, when Andrew Cuomo jumped into the race for mayor of New York City. And I believe we might even talked about it at the time. He jumps into the race in the early spring. Immediately, he has a huge lead because he's the name that everybody knows. He's got a long history. He was governor for almost 11 years. Everybody else in the race was just either a lower level official, somebody nobody really knew that well, not in a widespread sense. And I think everyone thought it was Andrew's race to lose at that point. He had such a big lead. But there was always a couple of big questions about that, even with his big lead. One was, how was he going to campaign? And two, you knew there was going to be some anti-Cuomo vote out there because he had resigned from office as governor. He had a bruising style that alienated many Democrats. Were the New York City electorate ever going to coalesce behind somebody that was not Cuomo? And the answer to those two questions, we have them now. One is that Andrew Cuomo, widely seen as not running a very good campaign, running an old-style campaign now in the 2020s, where it just seemed like, sort of another sort of a retread candidate, wasn't up on the buzz, didn't do a lot of social media like Zohran Mamdani did, didn't catch on that affordability was going to be the real buzzword in this election. So first of all, his campaign was not great. Even his own people admitted that. And then second of all, as far as who coalesced the anti-Cuomo vote, who did people flock to? I mean, early on, you might have thought it would have been maybe a Brad Lander, who's been an experienced New York City politician, a name that's been known in the city for a while. Maybe an Adrian Adams, a city council member who might have attracted a lot of votes. But in the end, it was Zohran Mamdani, who from the beginning, he had the left wing of the party, the so-called Democratic Socialist. And then he ran a campaign that just really caught fire with young voters and then older voters who decided they wanted to move on to something new and try somebody else. And, one of the lines that we used in the election night coverage is hearkening back to the history of New York City mayoral elections way back 60 years ago when there was a surprise winner by the name of John Lindsay. A famous columnist wrote, "He was fresh and everybody else is tired." And that was written 60 years ago, but you could almost apply it broadly to sort of what happened to the New York City mayoral race this time around.
Yeah, I mean, I think of Mario Cuomo having served 12 years and then largely voters tired with him. He essentially beat himself in the end, and the position went to the Republican, Governor Pataki.
Yeah, and, Governor Pataki served 3 terms, 12 years, and, again, it's a little bit of a fatigue of a candidate. His numbers were not great. His poll numbers were not great at the end of 12 years. He took a look at that and realized the wise thing would be to go out on a high note, to finish 3 terms and that be it.
Yeah, we're speaking with Yancey Roy, Albany Bureau Chief for Newsday. The thing that got me, Yancey, is, we always talk about the money in politics, and billionaires were lining up behind Cuomo, and still the money did not impact, ultimately, the result of the election.
Yeah, and, money is a big factor in elections, and it always kind of plays out a little differently. I think that if this were, say, a statewide election where you had to get your message out to Long Island and Westchester and Buffalo and Albany, where you can flood the airwaves with ads, maybe the money would have had more of an influence. But, you're talking about one city. It's a huge city. But I think that maybe what we saw was that the money didn't come into as big of a factor when it was just one citywide race here.
I also found it very interesting, Yancey Roy, that when former Governor Andrew Cuomo gave his speech, accepting the fact that he had lost, his supporters in the room were very angry that he lost, and they were expressing that. But he immediately said, no, that's not who we are. We're going to support this guy. It's our city, and I'm going to work with him, and we're all going to work with him to try to make things better. And my cynical journalist brain went, what position is he looking for?
Well, look, I mean, there's been much said over the last few years about the demonization of enemies, and rather not enemies, but making political opponents and people with political differences as your enemy. I think of 2008, the presidential campaign, when Barack Obama defeated John McCain, and John McCain, took the high road when some of his supporters during his concession speech wanted to boo Obama, and he said much the same thing. We're not going to do that. We're better than that. But even though Andrew Cuomo did say that to his supporters, it was also notable that he was just didn't move off of the point that his viewpoint during this whole campaign was that this was a fight for the direction of the Democratic Party, and making it clear that his view, and certainly in his supporters' view, that they have the correct direction for the Democratic Party, the more centrist viewpoint, and not the more progressive viewpoint. And it's going to be interesting to see now going forward how that fight continues to play out within the Democratic Party, because we've got congressional elections, we've got legislative elections, and we've got the gubernatorial election next year.
Yeah, I also want to bring the media, that's us, Yancey, into this equation here. I read a really interesting analysis in the Columbia Journalism Review, and they were talking about, and this is the headline, legacy papers have been weird and hostile toward Zohran Mamdani. Now, the New York Times did a non-endorsement for the primary, and, they were really kind of harping on his, quote, lack of experience. And so a lot of these traditional media were wary of a full endorsement, and yet we saw when it came to media, Zohran Mamdani was ahead of all the other old school politicians. He was out doing videos, Instagram, in the streets, and bypassing a lot of the traditional media to build his coalition.
Well, it's here we are, right? 2025. It's the ways of communicating with your friends, your family, and your constituents, and the people that you want to get to vote for you are all different than they were in the last century, as we can now call it. And I think one of the things that came through was, yes, the way that he campaigned was different than what we might have seen even 10 years ago, and it was very effective. And, we've seen that developing over the last decade through use of Facebook and other platforms, Twitter. It's very different than it used to be. And I don't, it's not going to go back to the way it was 20 years ago. It's going to be interesting to see how this evolves as we keep going, forward in the next cycle of campaigns.
It's also going to be very interesting to see the new mayor-elect, Zohran Mamdani, make his way up to Albany with hat in hand and try to get the legislature to work on some of his proposals. Obviously, that is a major issue. Now, he was endorsed by Governor Hochul, which maybe she saw the tea leaves there. And so but he hasn't necessarily endorsed her for re-election. So it's kind of interesting to me that, we can make all the statements about we want during the election about what we're going to do, but then when it comes to a mayor in New York, you got to go to Albany.
Yeah, that's one of the sort of unknown things, perhaps, or sort of under the radar things about how government works, whether it's New York City and New York State and the sort of functions in between, is that even though the city is the biggest city in the country, they have to, whoever's mayor, whether it's Michael Bloomberg or Eric Adams or Bill de Blasio, you have to come to Albany to get the green light or the funding for a lot of the things you want to do. And, right off the bat, some of the things that come to mind from Mamdani's campaign promises were such things as free buses, universal free child care. Right off the top of, those are the things that really jump out immediately that he'll need Albany help. So how does he negotiate that? He's again, as we mentioned earlier, he's at the progressive wing of the party. Kathy Hochul, the governor, is more in the centrist part of the party. In between the two is the state legislature, pretty progressive state legislature.
Yep.
It's had its differences with Kathy Hochul at times. But there's a couple of interesting things to read already. First of all, is Kathy Hochul has expressed support for doing the child care initiative. So I think in sentiment, they're all in agreement. I think where it's going to come to the rubber meets the road is, okay, we all want to do this. How are we going to fund this? And I think you'll see probably from Mamdani a push to raise taxes, or at least raise city taxes on the wealthy. Kathy Hochul is not a fan of raising taxes.
No, she's not.
Right. Is there another way? Is there surplus money? Because the tax revenue has been coming in pretty good for the state. Is there another avenue for funding this? So I think it's going to be in those nitty-gritty, whatever you want to call it, sausage making of state legislation. How do you make that work? I think there's not a lot of big, obvious disagreements about goals right now between the governor and Mamdani and the legislature on some of these initiatives. It's going to be, how do you actually fund these things?
Yeah, and Mamdani seems to have read the tea leaves in at least one area, and that's public safety, where he was making a lot of statements, negative statements about the New York City police. And he's backed away from that, and he's keeping the city's police commissioner in her spot, and they just announced crime has gone down in certain categories. And his transition team, it looks like he's bringing in some previously experienced people in government. So I guess we'll see where that goes.
It's not unusual for a candidate to be a critic of some area of government, whether that's law enforcement or some other aspect. When you're on the outside looking in and you're criticizing the way of something, it should be run better or it's not running well. And then to come in, and when you're the executive, you're the mayor or the governor, that's just a different role. And now you're in charge of things. And you can't simply sit back and be a critic of how something should work. You're now in charge of making it work better. And it would not be surprising to see Mamdani kind of evolve in his position from critic of the police to, okay, now you criticize it. Okay, so now what's your real plan for making things run better for the police and for the citizenry?
Yeah, and, there's a big thing, kind of like a big dark cloud hanging over all of this, and that's the Trump administration. I mean, President Trump has weighed in specifically on the New York City race. He's fed more information into it, calling him a communist. He's not. He's a democratic socialist. That's different. And, he and a lot of other Republicans are going after he being a Muslim and trying to equate it to a jihadist, saying he's anti-Semitic, all sorts of divisive things. But, what can the Trump administration do? They say they're going to pull money from the city.
The Trump administration has sent in National Guard or other sort of military law enforcement kind of aspects into other cities. And Kathy Hochul has been talking about, they're aware that there's this kind of threat from Trump about doing the same to New York City. You step aside for a second, and people are saying, have said all through the campaign, how appropriate is it anyway for a president to sort of weigh in a city election and say, if it doesn't come out the way I want it, I'm going to do something and try to, send law enforcement or military into your city. But
Trump to New York City, drop dead.
Put that aside for a second. Kathy Hochul has talked and said that her agencies have had discussions about how they might react if that happens. The state attorney general has had calls with legislative members to also make them aware that they are prepared or they're at least thinking about how to react. So I think, it's not catching anybody by surprise. I think people are aware that something could happen. Now, listen, the other part of this is all of that you're referring to that Trump said came ahead of the election. What we saw on election night, generally speaking, around the country was a lot of wins for Democrats.
Yep.
Does that change what Trump wants to do and how he acts? We've got this government shutdown still going on, which has been, I think, could fairly be seen as hurting some of the Republicans on Tuesday night. Does that change anything going forward? So there's a lot of unknowns at this moment.
Yeah, there certainly are. Well, one thing that is known is that Elise Stefanik wants to be the governor of New York, and she has been sending out every day blasts against Governor Hochul, and including Zohran Mamdani, and, tying them together. She's also used divisive language, calling him a terrorist and a communist, same kinds of stuff. But does the fact that Mamdani won give her an opening?
Well, Mamdani, identifying as a democratic socialist, he's been a target for Republicans for a while now, since he emerged as the front runner in the mayoral race. And it's not just Stefanik; it's a lot of Republicans. It's the apparatus of the Republican State Committee. It's candidates all over the place. You mentioned Elise Stefanik, but let's introduce Bruce Blakeman, who is the Nassau County executive.
And they ran against Mamdani.
Who, yes, to a large extent, some of their campaign was about Mamdani, about crime in New York City, which, as you mentioned, is on the way down in a lot of categories. But still, that's sort of an MO of campaigning. And Bruce Blakeman is another guy who has also been mentioned as a potential Republican gubernatorial candidate. And let's look at that for a second. Whereas we talk about Democratic wins in a lot of places, you talk about Mamdani, you talk about some of the other states, how the outcomes went for Democrats. New Jersey, there was a ballot initiative in Maine about absentee voting that the Democrats won. Where did Republicans really do well? Nassau County on Long Island. Bruce Blakeman, who won election in 2021 by a fingernail, this time around cruises easily. I think the final total was about 12 points. He was able to win. The Nassau Republican district attorney also able to win by about 12 points. So, the Republican brand still playing well in Nassau County. And, Bruce Blakeman, as we said, is another guy who's been mentioned as a potential gubernatorial candidate. He comes from a pretty large base, Nassau County, one of the largest counties in the state. And, he's going to be fresh off a big win, and he might be in that conversation as well.
Well, we can't forget about a very important part of this conversation, which is the governor's lieutenant governor, former Congressman Antonio Delgado. There's like a stick in her side. He's going around running against her right now. And maybe part of mitigating that was her endorsement of Mamdani.
Yeah, I think a lot of people saw that as, set aside how she might personally relate with Mamdani or whatever. I think that people, you're right, did see that as Hochul, wanting to shore up Democratic support and not have a split within the party as we head into 2026, that it was just smart politics for her to endorse Mamdani and try to make friends with a lot of the left end of the party that's been very critical of her. So we'll see how that goes forward. Look, Hochul as an incumbent governor, any incumbent governor, whether it's Andrew Cuomo or George Pataki, you've got a lot of campaign ammunition at your disposal. You've got lots of money in your campaign chest. Kathy Hochul has been a really good fundraiser. You've got, generally speaking, you have a lot of unions on your side because There's a lot of state work being done that affects unions, whether it's the state workforce or contracts or what have you. So you have a head start there. But at the same time, you don't want a wedge within your party support. You don't want one wing of the party breaking off from you. Now, to work back to Delgado, he is out there. He wants to be the progressive face of the party. He is running against Kathy Hochul. He has been going around the state having these little roundtable discussions. I actually dropped in on one in Saratoga Springs just a week ago where he was trying to meet with community leaders and find out where he thinks government could work better. And it was a very cordial meeting. There wasn't a lot of campaigning. Afterwards, he says he's gaining information because he thinks people want change. Now, Mamdani's winning on Tuesday has to be a good sign to him. So, they'll be saying, look, people want more progressive policies. They want to break with the past. I'm somebody new. Support me. That said, it's just an uphill battle against an incumbent governor in your own party, especially when Delgado is not going to have the same kind of fundraising totals that a Kathy Hochul would have.
Yeah, and if we project forward, now 2026 is a long way away. But depending on...
Is it really?
Good point, Yancey. Good point. And he is Yancey Roy, Albany Bureau Chief for Newsday. But some of the policies of the Trump administration as they're playing out right now are not only hurting Democratic states, but they're hurting Republican states as well when it comes to things like SNAP benefits, ACA health care, potential surges of folks with their health insurance premiums. I mean, if you look at the map that good journalists have put out and political organizations, you could argue that the red states are being hurt a little bit more even than the blue states. And, when it comes to the gubernatorial election here, that could be really good news for Governor Hochul.
A lot of, in a sense, go back to what you said before, a long ways away. There's a lot of cards to be played before we get towards Election Day in 2026.
See, I told you.
Yeah. We got the shutdown, which we still don't know exactly how the fallout of that's going to play out in terms of who gets blamed. On the congressional level, you've got a lot of states trying to redistrict right now. Some of them who have.
Let's talk
especially
about that.
Republican states, North Carolina and others, who redistricting meaning redrawing the boundaries of your congressional districts, and in Republican states, a handful so far, they've kind of broken with convention. Instead of doing them right after the census, they're doing them in the middle of the decade so as to help some of their candidates. That might tilt the playing field in their favor.
California?
So California might do it for the Democrats. We don't know how that's going to play out for any of the congressional districts or the congressional balance. So a lot of things to play out here over the next 12 months. And in a gubernatorial election, that's a little bit different than a congressional one. Again, we have to sort of figure out who the Republican field is going to be in New York and what issues kind of come to the fore.
Yeah, I agree, Yancey. But, I want to try to pin you down on something. Journalists don't like to give their opinions, but to me...
Me neither.
To me, the redistricting process is the most undemocratic process we have in this country, and now it's been weaponized. Any thoughts?
The way redistricting is set up, the state legislatures in every state get to draw the map, and you might inherently say, well, every state legislature is going to try to tilt it to the D or the R side. And there's only some federal voting protections, federal voting rights that kind of prevent it from being too gerrymandered or too drawn to, say, hurt minority voters. It's not overall, it's a pretty partisan process. It's with the exception of some of those federal voting right guarantees, there's not much else that says it has to be all that fair. So that's why you see a lot of court challenges like you saw in New York last time around.
And judge shopping.
It's as partisan. It's just about as partisan as you can get when it comes to the function of government. It's redistricting because drawing those lines and who's going to be in what district often forecast which party is going to control the seat.
Well, I can't control the time, and we are completely out of it. Yancey, Yancey Roy, Albany Bureau Chief for Newsday, our guest this week on the Capitol Connection. Love talking to you, Yancey. We'll get back together at some point. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Dave.
Support for the Capitol Connection comes from New York State United Teachers, working to support students, educators, and public schools as the center of their communities through the Public Schools Unite Us initiative.